So it's 2021, and the MAGAs are still arguing that public health mandates related to COVID trample on their constitutional rights, infringe on their freedom, and are only used in communist countries. Let's talk about why that's dumb. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing something a little different from my last two videos in the sense that I'm really just going to be ranting about some things that pissed me off in 2020, and I just assumed I wouldn't make a video on them because we spent most of 2020 trying to deal with this issue, and yet it's still ongoing into 2021, and I'm trying to have some fresh new energy. So what I'm going to be doing today is just a quick get ready with me. If you're looking for like makeup tips, don't look to me here. Go watch some beauty gurus. I'm just going to be putting on my makeup and chatting. And what I'm going to be chatting about is this argument that's been floating around in the Republican Trump party zeitgeist when it comes to public health mandates, specifically mask mandates and stay-at-home orders, because there's been a long-standing argument that the reason MAGAs don't like these mandates is not because they have issues with masks, it's just because they trample on their freedoms as Americans, which means that it's inherently un-American, that the founding fathers are rolling in their graves. Those arguments really do represent a lack of knowledge about American history, particularly about the founding fathers. So I have some notes in front of me. Hopefully I can read them because I have to take off my glasses to do my makeup. Let us chat. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea that the founding fathers would not approve of how largely, I guess, liberal representatives, some conservative representatives as well, that the founding fathers wouldn't approve of the mask mandates and the health orders. And the first thing we need to chat about before we get into like anything about the founding fathers is just like, when did healthy skepticism of just believing everything a politician says to you go away? Like, obviously we have this partisan divide where if you are liberal or just anti-Trump in any way, anything like a Trump-loving or Trump-supporting government official says, you side-eye. If you're conservative, if you're really MAGA, anyone that's remotely liberal or just not in line with Trump says is a lie, and then everything that the person you agree with says is true. I'm just really curious why we no longer want to hear what a public official says, particularly someone in the National Congress, and go, that's 100% true. They're absolutely right, because politicians have never lied to me before in my life. That's insane, because literally there's this thing in politics called the spin room. Whenever somebody has like a election debate, or I guess mostly election debates is where general public sees it. My spray bottle is set to spray cats, not sponges. And spin rooms essentially are, after a debate, the candidates and their campaign managers go into a room and someone says, hey, your campaign this up, and then the campaign manager, the candidate's like, well, actually what happened is we made a deliberate choice. It was a strategic choice to be bad in this debate. And essentially it's just lying. They just lie, and we call it a spin room because you spin the narrative. It's a lie. That's all it is. Like, we have lies embedded into our politics, and yet people hear someone like Ted Cruz, who's a massive hypocrite, get on his little Bird app and I don't know if he has a Twitter, gets on Parler or whatever, and he goes, well, the founding fathers would never have stood for this. And I'm like, Mr. Cruz, Senator Cruz, what do you know about the founding fathers? And particularly when we're looking at, in recent times, public officials, they're not, I would say overwhelmingly, these aren't people that have a background education that goes in depth with U.S. history and American politics. Because public education and what we talk about in public U.S. history changes from state to state, probably from county to county. There's a lot of partisanship when it comes to public education, so there's a lot of things you just don't learn about in public school. And even if you go on to get a degree in political science or something like that, I know my degree, I have a bachelor's of science in political science, and it was very much like, here's some basic courses, and then half of this is just pick your electives. What do you want to learn about? I wanted to learn about Latin America. Apparently, they didn't make me take a class on presidents or anything. I could take just whatever type of class I wanted to. And so you have these people getting into politics. And traditionally, I would say a lot of the people that get elected have been business people because they have money for campaigns, because campaigning is expensive. And business people may be good with money, depending on what type of business person you are. They may be good with trade and that sort of thing, but they did not study a lot of American politics. So they really don't have much of an idea what the founding fathers were like or what they would have said unless they've just been reading US history in their free time, which we know most of them are not because they're in back rooms being wined and dined to play politics or trade stocks illegally or whatever they're doing. So they don't know about US history. Not as much as the public is trusting them to know about US history. And then as we get more into recent times, we're seeing that politics are getting more accessible, especially with the last, I would say 2 or 3 election cycles. You see, we have astronauts in politics now. We're seeing more teachers. We're seeing social workers. There's always been a good amount of retired military in politics and all that sort of stuff. So these are people who are not inherently credible when they tell you things about the founding fathers. I cannot emphasize that enough. If a politician says something that the founding fathers would have, please go research it, because more likely than not, the founding fathers probably had no opinion about it, because they just could not fathom the country we live in today. When they were back there writing the Constitution, I'm a fan of the Constitution amended version when Black people got rights. I'm a big fan of that part. But when they were writing this Constitution, they couldn't comprehend things like globalization. They couldn't comprehend things like internet echo chambers. They couldn't comprehend that when they were writing the Constitution. So when we just blanket assume that they would have done XYZ with whatever is happening in recent America, that's a hard thing to sell. And then, on top of that, the founding fathers were dumb. Don't get me wrong, there were some brilliant thinkers in the founding fathers, some brilliant writers, because they had to write the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, brilliant writer. Alexander Hamilton, just brilliant in general. James Madison, also super clever. They were political philosophers, so they were political thinkers. So when it comes to things like public health, they were not experts, and they were dumb about it. If you've never looked into the yellow fever that hit America during George Washington's, I think it was his second term. I'm not positive, but I think it was his second term. If you don't know anything about that, essentially what happened was we had this giant plague hit America called the yellow fever. People were dropping like flies. I want to say 10% of the population died. They were literally decimated. And the founding fathers had no idea what to do. You know what they did? They made it a partisan issue. You had Aham over in this corner going well, if you drink this type of wine and blah, 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 you will have a cure from the yellow fever. And then you have over here going no, actually, this cure is better. And it turns out neither cure was good. But they were just too busy tooting their own horns and being all political and partisan that we almost lost the entire country. America was almost destroyed before it got a chance to start. And people are out here going well, the founding fathers would have never stood for these health mandates. It's the founding fathers almost destroyed the country before you were born because they were too busy being partisan to figure out a pandemic. They were too busy playing politics, doing exactly what we're doing now to get anything done. And the only reason America did not just die, what am I trying to say? Infancy? Yes. The only reason that America didn't die in infancy was luck, because the cold snap came and it killed the mosquitoes. They thought that the yellow fever was being spread through the air. Kind of familiar. But they were wrong about it. We're right, they were wrong. And if the cold snap had not have come, who knows what would have happened to America? I'm of the opinion that it probably would have collapsed, but the point of the matter is that glorifying the founding fathers is stupid. Because the founding fathers, much like our current politicians, were human beings. And human beings are inherently fallible. They make mistakes, they do things wrong, they make bad decisions. It's just a fact, it's just what being human is. And then on top of that, you have to remember that everyone who was involved in framing America, everyone who wrote the Constitution, who was in the first cabinets and who was in the first Congress and all that sort of things, those were people who had something to gain and something to lose in the political system they were building. So while they did build the system that was intended to work for the greater good, for the greatest number of people, there were things in the Constitution, things the founding fathers did that were inherently selfish and therefore not something that we should be glorifying. But people do it anyways. And it just really gets to, like, you know, that old saying, history repeats itself. We're sitting here repeating history because people want to glorify this false image of the founding fathers they have, as opposed to just looking at the facts, looking at history, and go, you know what the founding fathers did with this pandemic? We should maybe not do that. That looked like a bad idea. That almost ruined the country. We should maybe learn from their mistakes and not make it a partisan issue. But no, because the people in politics didn't study politics. Unless you're Mitch McConnell, then you're just a piece of... Then you are just making decisions for the sake of holding power as opposed to the moral or correct thing to do. Let's use that word instead. I'm going to do eyeshadow. I don't know if I remember how to do eyeshadow because I've been following public health mandates, so I haven't been going out. Now we're going to move on to the other argument, which is that these health orders, mask mandates, stay-at-home orders, lockdowns are inherently un-American because they trample on your freedoms. And this argument really does boil down to Republican politicians who know what they're doing, just feeding lies to the public so that they stay in power. And then it also comes down to a bad education system where we teach these things either too early and don't explain it, or we just don't explain it at all, or we skip it entirely, I'm sure, in some regions of the country. All those lovely handy-dandy things that America does that is stupid. And that's the social contract. So the social contract is this... it's basically the theory behind having a government. What the social contract says is that in order to have safety and security in the world, mankind has governments, and you give up some of your freedoms and wealth to the government in exchange for the government keeping you safe. So if you do not want to give up your freedoms and wealth, you leave society, and if you do want the security of government, you follow the damn rules. And so, one of the people who wrote about this was actually a founding father. I know I just said a lot about not glorifying founding fathers, but I also did say that they were great political thinkers. So we're going to talk about Thomas Paine's political thoughts, because he had some good ones. So Thomas Paine, if you do not remember, because I don't even remember when we talked about it in my public school education, much less where it's supposed to be talked about. So Thomas Paine was an American writer and philosopher and a founding father. And what Thomas Paine did, the reason why we remember him, is he wrote two of the pamphlets that essentially inspired the American Revolution. He wrote these two very formative pieces of political thought and commentary in 1776 through like 1783, I believe it was. I don't know that off the top of my head. I looked it up and I took notes, but my notes are covered by makeup, but I believe those are the dates. So he wrote Common Sense in 1776, and he wrote The American Crisis from 76 to 83. And those two works are largely contributed as being the inspiration for the American Revolution. So when we talk about the Founding Fathers, you talk about a guy like Thomas Jefferson who wrote the Declaration of Independence, which while it's not a governing document in the country, it greatly is kind of the theory behind America's existence. So that's why we still hold it up in high regard. And Common Sense by Thomas Paine is kind of similar in that vein, where it's not a like ruling document of the United States, but it's very much the theory behind why we exist. And Thomas Paine is essentially the guy who helped inspire a lot of the founding fathers that we have all these politicians and MAGAs saying would be rolling over in their graves right now. And Thomas Paine's thinking is also kind of the foundation of what it is to be American, because we wouldn't have America if people like Thomas Paine hadn't been dropping these fire pamphlets and inspiring people to give up their lives for a country that did not yet exist or have any proof that it was going to work. And I actually have a copy of Common Sense on my bookshelf. It's public domain, so I will link the full thing below. Keep in mind, it was written in the 18th century, so it's not the most simple read, but I do think Thomas Paine is pretty good at getting his point across in a way that does kind of transcend the kind of Shakespearean, what the hell is he saying to me? I don't understand. And so Common Sense had a couple of different points that really, I think, apply to this situation and apply to the reason why all of these arguments and tirades that people are having literally just don't make sense with the country we live in. And so the first aspect of Common Sense, which again, we're talking about the social contract, is you give up blanket freedom in return for safety. So basically what this is saying is you're not free to do whatever you want whenever you feel like it, because you live in a society and the society has rules to keep the greater good safe. And so that's the reason why I can't go out and murder my neighbor because I feel like it. It's the reason why I can't go to Target and just steal a TV because I feel like it. I give up some of my freedoms. It's the reason why you can't just go 90 on the highway because you feel like it. It's the reason why people have to go to school, because the government has decided that in exchange for the safety and security it's providing for us, we should be educated for the betterment of society. Which honestly, if the MAGAs want to make the argument that something's trampling on their freedoms, I feel like they would have an excellent argument for saying I can be ignorant whenever I want, because they sure are doing it. I can't see, so I don't know if this makeup looks good. I hope it looks good. If I look like a clown, please feel free to roast me in the comments, but keep in mind that we're actually talking about politics, not makeup. And then the other aspect of this I mentioned earlier, which is if you want blanket freedom, if you want to be able to do whatever you want whenever you feel like it, just leave society. Go homestead. Go start a commune, which is its own type of society, so you'd still be whatever. And so I have a couple of excerpts from Common Sense here, and the first one is basically talking about how men are not inherently good. And this is a theory of man that goes back to Greek philosophy. The argument is are men inherently good or are they not? And the argument behind the social contract, and the argument I think most people believe with these days because we're much more cynical, a lot of people believe that men are not inherently good. And so what Thomas Paine said was, let me put on my glasses so I can actually read what he said. For were the impulses of conscience clear, uniform, and irresistibly obeyed, man would need no other lawgiver, but that not being the case, he finds it necessary to surrender up a part of his property to furnish means for the protection of the rest. If men were good and unselfish, we wouldn't need to give up any of our freedoms. But since people are selfish and not inherently good, we give up some of our freedoms. And this specifically also says you give up some of your money, that's taxes, so that you can have security, because giving up some of your freedoms is better than being murdered. And this is also why when people get real up on their high horses about how taxes are communist, they're not. They're just an aspect of living in a government, including an American one, because the American founding fathers that you like to glorify specifically agreed with this theory of government, that this is how it's supposed to work. So that's that. And then Thomas Paine goes on to kind of talk about explain why government is necessary. Thomas Paine gives us, I'm going to call it a parable because I am of the opinion that people use the Constitution like people use the Bible, which is that you just blanketly believe everything that is written, even though the person who wrote it had an agenda. Because, King James, when he made the King James version of the Bible, he had an agenda for that. He had a reason why he didn't like the original ones. the earlier versions of the Bible. And that's the same thing with the Constitution, is yeah, there's some really good stuff in it, but it was written with an agenda. So in this parable, Thomas Paine says, let's say somehow we find a patch of land that is completely cut off from society. You're just dropped in the dead middle of the wilderness. You drop like 4 or 5 people there. What's going to happen? And so he says, well, essentially, in order to survive, you have a long list of things that need to get done. And while every man could go and do just his own list on his own, eventually he's going to need to take a break. You know, man needs to sleep. Man needs to eat. You can't do everything without a break. So if you're working by yourself and you take a break, then things just aren't going to be getting done anymore. But if you combine your efforts with someone else, you turn to your neighbor and you're like, hey, I need to go take a nap. Can you work on this while I'm asleep? Then you can get your rest and you can also make progress. However, the person you asked for help is also going to need a rest. And so they're going to ask their neighbor. I'm struggling with this eyeliner today. And then so on and so forth. Everyone's going to need a break at some point. Now, on the flip side, Thomas Paine says that if you want to work by it on your own, things are going to get bad. And I have an excerpt from Common Sense for this. And what Thomas Paine says, and the reason I'm reading this verbatim is because I just think it's very topical for the moment that we're in. And so he says that disease, nay, even misfortune would be death, for though neither might be mortal, yet either would disable him from living and reduce him to a state in which he might rather be said to perish than to die. And so in this section, Thomas Paine is saying, like, if you decide to do it all by your own, and you catch a cold, or you break your pinky toe, or something, like things that aren't inherently fatal, they're not, you know, that in itself is not going to kill you. But let's say you're chopping down wood for the winter and you break your wrist or something, that's not going to kill you, but you're going to need to stop chopping wood. And then let's say by the time your wrist cures, by the time you're able to chop wood again, it's winter, which means you don't have enough wood for the winter. So even though that broken wrist in itself did not kill you, the consequences are you don't have enough wood to make it through winter, so that could kill you. And that's why man cannot strike out on their own without society. That's why we create societies, like from an anthropological standpoint, from the study of humans. I'm not an anthropologist, but from that standpoint, you know, you go back in history and man has been creating society basically since man existed. We had all these river valley civilizations at the very beginning. If you haven't watched History of the Entire World, I guess, that chats about it, so I'll link that below. That's a fun video. A little bit like being bombarded by information. It's a little bit overwhelming, but essentially men just tends to create a society because you just can't strike it out alone. You can't do it. You're going to get hurt at some point, you're going to get sick at some point, and you're going to need the help of another person. So if we review our 2 points so far, 1, man is not inherently selfless and inherently good. So you need some sort of rules. And then we're breaking down that argument with 2, man inherently needs society. We need help in order to survive in the wilderness. And while America is no longer the wilderness, it was at one point. And right now what it is we need society to help save us from political conflict and from street violence and that sort of things. Like, we still need government to help keep us safe, support us in COVID because people are getting sick, so you need unemployment benefits, you know, all that sort of things. The things that were put in the CARES Act really do reflect this argument that you need help, because while losing your job, getting furloughed for 4 weeks may not inherently kill you, not getting paid means that you can't pay rent, so you don't have housing anymore. Not getting paid means that you can't buy food, so you're not being nourished anymore. So you need the assistance of society to survive, even if what happened to you in itself is not inherently fatal. And then point number 3 is that just being in society isn't good enough. You need a government. And for that, I have my 3rd excerpt from Common Sense, where Thomas Paine says that only heaven is pure, since man is not pure. We're just not. It's just a fact. Since man is not pure, at some point when all the basic needs are taken care of, man is not going to want to inherently work for the common good anymore. We're going to get selfish once again because all of our basic needs are met. And therefore, at that point, it's the government's job to step in and make sure that we continue to work together. And he says the remissness will point out the necessity of establishing some form of government to supply the defect of moral virtue. Let me find my contour kit first, and we're going to run through what he's saying. So he's saying, 1, you can't survive alone. 2, having society is great, but at some point, man's just not going to work with each other anymore. We're going to get selfish because we're not morally upstanding inherently all the time. And so at that point, it's the government's job to step in. It's the government's job. It's why we have government, to step in and enforce laws and rules that make up for the lack of moral purity among man. And by existing in a society with government, by getting the protections of government, the social contract says that you then give up the freedom to ignore whatever they say we need to do for the moral prerogative. So how does that relate to COVID? Well, because the first step in fighting COVID was not, nobody was like, I'm sure somebody might have said it, but a lot of the politicians who did eventually create a mask mandate or a public health order or a lockdown, they didn't start out by going, we're going to make this a law immediately. Where we started in March was people going, like the CDC, like, hey, everyone, please wear a mask. And your executives, your governors were like, hey, everyone, please give a mask. I watched a video the other day of the Georgia governor saying, like, I'm not going to impose a mask mandate because I trust you all can do it on your own.
And while we all agree that wearing a mask is effective, I'm confident that Georgians don't need a mandate to do the right thing.
And guess what happened? We couldn't do it on our own. And so, because man was not voluntarily, because we as citizens were not voluntarily willing to give up some selfishness in order to help the greater good of society, because we have at-risk people in society, we are reaching 350,000 deaths. We're nearing that mark because we could not do that of our own volition. I mean, some of us did. But since the greater majority of people in this society could not do that of their own volition, then it is the government's job to step in and make a rule to do so. And that's what happened. We got the mask mandates. We got the stay-at-home orders. This is literally what is happening, is how government's supposed to work. If the government didn't do that, it would not be working. And that's something that, it's not just Thomas Paine saying that we need the government to step in and be moral. You had in Federalist 51, which was written by either Alexander Hamilton or James Madison, they say this famous quote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." But we're not. We were not willing to give up. We were not willing to do the slight inconvenience of wearing a thin piece of fabric over our mouth and nose when we were around other people who could possibly be sick or who could possibly be at risk. People were not willing to do that of their own volition out of the goodness of their heart. So the government said, okay, now we need to make rules. And then suddenly, the MAGAs are going, well, I have no problem with masks. I just have problems with my freedoms being trampled on. But your freedoms are not being trampled on. This is just the social contract. This is the exchange that we have continuously made the entire run of America's existence. The thing that we have agreed to literally up until this point. We've agreed to the social contract, you can't murder. We've agreed with the social contract you can't speed. We've agreed with the social contract that you need to get educated. But when the social contract, when the government says, hey, you should help us save lives, suddenly that's too far. Do you see why this does not make sense? It literally doesn't make sense. And obviously there is the concern that if a bad person gets into power, if we have, say, an authoritarian leader, if they get into power, my almost empty setting spray, are the mandates they're going to make going to reflect the social contract? Are they going to be for the greater good, for the greater number of people? Are they going to be for the greater good of society, or is it going to be selfish? And we know that authoritarian leaders are usually selfish. And that's where checks and balances come in the Constitution. It's why we have 3 branches of government. It's why we have the executive branch being checked by Congress. It's why we have Congress being checked by the judiciary. And obviously that struggled a little bit this year, but that's what the founding fathers put into place. And right now, America is a laughing stock. We have the most number of cases, and we're supposed to be like this shining city on a hill, is what America is supposed to be if you believe in American exceptionalism. So I'm curious for all the people who really want America to be great. I don't understand why you are okay with America having the most cases and one of the most uncontrolled spreads of the coronavirus. You had countries who were really big on the health mandates. They put it in force. Their citizens were willing to uphold their social contract and follow the rules, and they managed the first wave really well. Whereas America, we never got the first wave down. We went from first wave to second wave to probably a third wave coming up soon, because the vaccine rollout is just a show. Don't you want America to look good? Don't you want other countries to go hey, see how America handled this real fast because they have the money there, they were able to take care of COVID really quickly, but we don't want to do that. We would rather just throw a hissy fit because we don't want fabric over our mouths and nose. It blows my mind. And so my makeup is done, but I did just have one other point to talk about when it comes to this. Our freedoms, I refuse to let my freedoms be trampled. This is un-American because we're supposed to be the country of liberty. We have 2 founding documents. Let me grab my Constitution. We have 2 founding documents that really discuss how important liberty is. And I'm going to start with the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident: that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice which one comes first. It's not liberty. The first unalienable right discussed by the founding fathers when they decided to leave British rule was life. Life is the most important. Therefore, wearing a mask to prevent the loss of life is more important than your freedom to not. On to the Constitution. This is the preamble, which I believe most of us had to memorize in 8th grade or something. I was so stressed out about it. And then we all forgot it because we were just told to memorize it and we didn't really dive into what it was saying that much. So, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Let's rank these again. Where was liberty on that list? It was literally the last thing on the list. Promote the general welfare came first. Hi, editing Vessa here. I just want to make the addition that when we look at the order of priorities for the Founding Fathers in the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, it does not hurt to remember that one of the reasons why liberty was so low on the list for them was because they were keeping slaves. So, once again, historically, liberty has not been the driving founding principle of America as much as we'd like to pretend it has been. So that's that. The safety of the people in our nation was more important than blanket freedom. And that's why we have laws. That's why we have rules, because the safety and the health of the people in our society is more important than you being able to do whatever you want to do. That's just the fact. The founding fathers said it. The founding fathers said it twice. Then they said it a third time. They said it a fourth time. And then we get to the 21st century and we just blindly believe politicians who have a history of lying for their selfish purposes to maintain power when they tell us what the founding fathers would have wanted. Do you understand why that doesn't make sense? Especially if we look from really the big thing that pushed people to vote for Donald Trump was the belief that the government was being selfish and not working for them. If you believe that, why are you not still skeptical about anyone in government and what they're saying? I just feel like if you just took a second to not believe everything they said, we would be able to come to the rational conclusion that actually saving lives is more important than our freedom not to wear a mask and our freedom to go whenever we want, whenever we want. It's why we all take our shoes off at the airport, even though the airport floor is probably covered with disgusting germs. It's why we only take 3 ounces of lotion, even though that's ridiculous because I'm black and I get ashy and I need more lotion on the airplane. We're willing to be inconvenienced for the sake of saving lives in just about every other situation, but we're not willing to do it here. And obviously there is the caveat that there are a lot of people who have been indoctrinated and they believe that the science just isn't there for the masks. They believe that there's not a pandemic. I'm not here to argue with things that don't make sense, that aren't logical. We have the body bags to prove there's a pandemic. We have the death toll to prove that there is a pandemic. Obviously, people are getting desensitized because hitting 350,000 deaths is creating a lot less stir than the first 150,000, which I think says a lot about where we are as a country. If you're so pro-America, why don't you want to help prevent the loss of American lives? It doesn't make sense. So I guess to wrap it all up, when people get up on their Trump plane parade or Cruz gets up on the Twitter app or somebody stands up for their rally, Kelly girl stands up for her rally, and they say that the founding fathers never would have stood for public health mandates, and they say that these mandates are trampling on our freedom, which is un-American, when they say that public health orders are communist, that is just historically and factually incorrect. Because the founding fathers promoted life over liberty. The basis of the American government is that we give up some of our rights for the safety and security of the greater good. That's just the facts. That's just the tea. I don't know how to end it. It's just like, duh, period. That's the end of it. So that's going to be the end of my video. If you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed this format, please let me know because I do have other things that I would like to rant about, like the Blackwater pardons. And today, Cruz said that everyone who's calling actual sedition needs to calm down and tone down their rhetoric. We need to tone down our rhetoric. So I have some things that I would like to rant about. So if you liked the format of this video, please let me know down in the comments below. Also, I have learned recently that liking videos actually is helpful. So if you would like to like this video, I'd appreciate it. If you'd like to subscribe, I am going to still be sticking with a lot of the political, I guess more like comedy content, because I just think if politics was more fun, I think more people would be able to catch this stuff when it comes up and just be able to call out their public officials when they're lying like this. And also, if you like this format, please let me know if there's anything else you would like me to rant about. But yeah, I will be sticking to political comedy, so subscribe if you want more of that. If not, then thanks for coming. Happy New Year, happy Inauguration Day coming up, and I will see y'all next time. Bye!